What's going on, DDO players? Axel here. In this video, I'll be talking all about battle clerics. I decided to make this video for a few reasons. First of all, obviously, if you've seen my videos, you'd know that battle cleric is the build I use for my main character. It's also the build that I enjoy the most. There's also a lot of misconceptions out there about melee divines and melee clerics specifically, and I wanted to straighten a few of those up in this video. So we'll start with misconceptions, and then we'll go on to advantages of these types of builds and disadvantages. So first of all, let's talk about the biggest misconceptions and the biggest myths about battle clerics. The biggest one that I see, this used to be a big problem before Epic Destinies took over, since healers were a lot more desired in parties. It's not as big of a deal today, but the biggest myth is definitely that battle clerics can't heal. This is just completely false, and it's actually quite the opposite. Battle clerics or melee clerics are in actuality in most situations better healers than caster clerics for a few reasons. The biggest reason is that they're always positioned better to heal. Unlike caster clerics, who tend to hang near the back of the party, melee clerics are always up front. They're always closer to the other melee characters, who are normally the ones that need healing. So they can utilize Radiant Servant Aura and Radiant Servant Burst a lot better, simply because the characters that need healing from the cleric are usually going to be in range of them, whereas with caster clerics, oftentimes they can't use bursts very effectively, simply because they're hanging near the back of the party away from the melees. The second part of this myth is that the can't heal myth is players will look at the lower SP pool of a battle cleric and think that means that they can't heal. But this is a flawed thought for a few reasons. Let's think about how melee clerics or battle clerics fight in combat. They don't cast spells, they're using a weapon. So that means, yes, they might have 500 or 1,000 less spell points than a caster cleric, but their entire spell point bar can be devoted towards healing, whereas caster clerics are always splitting their spell points between healing and casting. Because battle clerics can devote all of their SP to healing, they actually, I would argue, have more healing available in most situations than a caster cleric, simply because their DPS does not rely on their spell points, unlike caster clerics. The second biggest myth is that battle clerics are terrible DPS. Now, I'm not going to sit here and argue that battle clerics are the best build in their game. They're certainly not. And I'm not going to sit here and try to argue that battle clerics are the best DPS in the game, because they're definitely not. But DPS on a battle cleric is a lot better than most people believe. No, it's not top tier, and it takes a hit compared to pure melee classes like Paladin, Barbarian, and Bard, but with proper gearing and proper building, proper twitch fighting, you can exceed the DPS of all but the very best pure melee class players. And most of the time when I'm in a party, I do have the best melee DPS, and I often lead the kill count, just simply because my character is geared better and built better than most other players. The biggest reason, the most important thing to disprove this myth is that you need to consider Epic Destinies. Yes, melee clerics take a hit in the DPS department because they don't have access to the higher abilities in some of these Paladin and Fighter, Barbarian melee trees, but Epic Destinies close most of this gap. Epic Destinies, in terms of power, override much of the heroic enhancements, and when we get into destinies like Legendary Dreadnought and Divine Crusader, we find that the melee DPS that those trees provide really shrinks the gap between the cleric class and other pure melee classes. It makes the difference from the melee class heroic enhancements much less, much smaller issue. Let's talk about a few the main advantages of running a melee cleric or a battle cleric. As I mentioned before, melee clerics offer the most effective party healing in the game. The combination of aura and burst on a frontline melee just can't be matched by your backline offensive casting healers. As I said, melee clerics are often, if not almost always, in a better position to heal with Radiant Servant, so they get a lot more mileage out of it. I personally don't play a lot of caster clerics for this reason. It's so much harder to heal on caster clerics because instead of being able to use burst to just hit a burst like without thinking, you have to actually oftentimes target the person you want to heal on a caster, since you're normally not upfront with the melees. Another huge advantage of a melee cleric is, in my opinion, they are the most self-sufficient build in the game and the most convenient build in the game. I don't think there's a whole lot of argument to this. If someone else can throw out some more classes in the comment section that they think are more self-sufficient than melee clerics, I'm all ears, but hear me out for my argument. When we think about self-sufficiency, we think about self-healing first of all. And melee clerics and all clerics have the best self-healing of any class in game, hands down. They have an endless supply in the form of regenerating Radiant Bursts and Radiant Auras, and very few classes have regenerating self-healing. Now there's a few like Paladins who have regenerating Lay on Hands, but Lay on Hands are not near as good as what we get from Radiant Servant. Also, melee clerics are very self-sufficient because they have access to endless DPS, as do all melee characters. Unlike an offensive caster, you never run out of DPS because your DPS comes from your weapon. The only way you can run out of DPS is if every weapon in your backpack breaks. Another advantage, melee clerics get all critical buffs inherently. They get Death Ward, Freedom of Movement, True Seeing, Protection from Evil, Restoration, Resist Energy, just to name a few. They don't have to spend a whole lot of time gearing and farming for stuff like Death Ward clickies, Freedom Movement boots, etc. They have all that stuff inherently, so you can roll up a new character and not have to worry about gearing as much. You also have access to some nice spells like Cure Blindness, Disease, and Curse. Now, I would recommend that you carry potions anyway, simply because it will save you spell points. But if you want to save the backpack space, you can just use the spells. Clerics are one of the very few classes that can instantly remove all negative levels. You get access to Greater Restoration, which is an amazing spell. I believe Favored Souls are the only other class that have access to this spell, but Greater Restoration instantly removes all of your negative levels. In addition, clerics also get Radiant Burst, which does not remove all of them at once, but it removes, I believe, 1 to 4 negative levels per burst. So they can, even if they don't have any spell points, they can still use Burst to remove negative levels for free. The only other way another class can use Greater Restoration is if they have a high UMD score. I believe it requires something around 44 UMD, if I remember correctly. So clerics definitely have an advantage when it comes to removing negative levels. Another nice spell that clerics get, which is not an issue if you have UMD, but if you don't have UMD, you'll still get the spell Word of Recall, which is basically a poor man's version of teleport. It teleports you to House D. This is very nice to have, as I said, if you don't have UMD. Teleport's obviously better, but at least it's something. It saves you a lot of time if you don't have UMD. Say you want to come back from Evening Star, you don't have to go through the cave. You can just hit Word of Recall and come back to Eberron. And you won't have to bother with other shortcut methods like setting your bind point in Eberron and having to slash death every time you want to get back there. Also, melee clerics, in my opinion, are the least rest shrine dependent build in the game. Even on 0 spell points, battle clerics don't lose much effectiveness. The only things they lose when they're down to 0 spell points is some of their action boosts, like um, Divine Might, which is a big loss. I'll guarantee you that. But they don't lose all of their abilities to be useful. They're still very useful even on 0 spell points. As I said, Battle Clerics obviously aren't casters, so they don't rely on their spell points for their DPS. They also don't rely on their spell points for self-healing. Even if you're out of spell points, you still have unlimited regenerating self-healing through Radiant Servant. So Battle Clerics never really have to shrine if they don't want to. And that's really nice not to be dependent on rest shrines. Let's talk about some of their combat abilities. Unlike regular melee classes, uh, Battle Clerics get some very helpful spells. The best of these are Blade Barrier and Symbol of Death, which is great for kiting enemies. A big problem classes like Paladin and Barbarian and Fighter have, say when they're soloing, is they have no crowd control, so they have problems dealing with huge groups of mobs. But a Battle Cleric can just throw down Symbol of Death and kite the enemies through it, and it'll stack a whole bunch of negative levels on them. They can also throw out a Blade Barrier and just kite the enemies around until they die. This is really nice, and it makes soloing a lot easier on a Battle Cleric than with a regular melee. I use this all the time, especially in quests where you're taking a lot of damage and you can't just melee everyone down. No, Battle Clerics don't have, obviously are not offensive casters, so they're not going to have a great Blade Barrier DC. But all this means is you have to kite for twice as long, because even if you have no DCs at all in Evocation, your Blade Barrier is still always going to hit for at least half damage. So this really is not a problem. It just increases the time you have to kite compared to a caster cleric. Another big advantage is Battle Clerics usually don't have to heal themselves in combat, the exception being some Epic League content. If you have a lot of heal amp on your character, you can just hit your Radiant Servant aura and it constantly regens your health. So you don't, unlike other classes, you don't lose DPS by having to stop swinging and heal yourself. And this adds up to quite a bit of DPS. This is something that a lot of players don't consider, but if you don't have to stop to heal yourself, that's an extra 3 swings or so that you're saving. Let's talk about some disadvantages of melee clerics. The biggest disadvantage is they have little to no crowd control, and this is the biggest issue when trying to solo with them. Now you're in a lot better position than pure melee classes. As I've mentioned, you do have Symbol of Death and Blade Barrier, but you still don't have any way to hold mobs or stun multiple mobs unless you were to build for Stunning Blow, but that doesn't do a whole lot for you because of the cooldown against huge groups of mobs. But so for the most part, Battle Clerics don't have crowd control, so that's a big disadvantage over a caster. And as I've mentioned, Battle Clerics do have a lower DPS ceiling than other melee classes. However, this is not as much as you'd think, since Epic Destinies, for the most part, override heroic enhancements. And you can make up for this with, you can even make up with for the melee enhancements with good gear, good building, and good twitch fighting. Another disadvantage is when you're playing a straight healer role, which does not happen too often in today's game, but if you're playing a straight healer role, you will have a lower healing ability in terms of your ability to heal over time because of your low spell point pool. Your spell point pool will be lower than caster clerics, so when you're in a pure healing role, you'll have to chug SP pots sooner than would a caster cleric. You take more damage as a melee cleric than you do on a caster cleric because you're on the front lines. Another big thing with melee clerics, and one of the big reasons why they have a bad name in game, or they did have a bad name for a long time, is you have to learn how to multitask. It's very important. You can't just sit there and get lost in melee combat. You always have to have one eye on the red bars and one eye on what you're doing in combat. Battle clerics for the longest time had a bad name because a lot of players played them who did not really know how to play the build properly, and they would get lost in melee combat and not heal. And that's where the whole battle clerics can't heal myth came from. So overall, I'm not trying to say battle clerics are the best overall builds in the game. They're certainly not. However, they're a lot better than most people think, and they are some of the better builds in the game in my opinion. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please subscribe and tell your DDO friends and guildies about my channel. Thanks for watching.